Welcome to another Tuesday Devotions together. My name is Pastor Dale, and we have been on a journey on the road to Easter. And here in week 4, we are going to talk about Jesus on trial. Last week, we looked at Jesus' Jewish trials, and there was a series of them, and they ended up condemning Jesus to death. But the Jewish leaders no longer had the authority to execute people. The Romans had taken that away, and so they would have to go to the Roman governor to have their verdict verified and to have Jesus killed. And so in Mark 15, we read, "Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and the teachers of the law and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. And they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate." Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor of Judea from 26 AD to 36 AD, a fairly long tenure for a Roman governor. We don't know anything about his early life before he arrived in Judea. He probably rose through the ranks in the Roman army to reach this position. But as governor, he didn't live in Jerusalem. He lived 75 miles north in the city of Caesarea. But during festivals such as Passover, he would come to Jerusalem, and with a few extra troops, he would make sure that there was no trouble that happened, because Jewish festivals was a time ripe for rebellion and for troubles. And so Pilate was in Jerusalem at this time. We know a little bit about his career as governor of Judea from two Jewish historians. Josephus, who wrote about 30 to 50 years after these events, tells us some details. And then Philo, who wrote only about 10 years after these events, gives us more details. And according to their reports, Pilate was a strong, unbending ruler. He wouldn't back down to the Jews. And in fact, in his early career, he had had several clashes with the Jewish leaders and the Jewish crowd, and it had led to riots and to bloodshed. In fact, the Jewish leaders had complained about Pilate to the emperor, and Caesar had reprimanded Pilate for his actions. And so as we come to the case of Jesus, Pilate is kind of in a fix. He cannot afford another conflict with the Jews. He cannot afford another riot or another bad report. And so that is why in the trial of Jesus, Pilate appears to be wishy-washy and giving in to the Jewish leaders. But of all the men who judged Jesus, I think Pilate may have been the most fair. While the Jewish leaders condemned Jesus even before they had tried him, Pilate seems to try and find out the truth. Several times he will say that Jesus has done nothing worthy of death, and he'll attempt to set him free. But in the end, Pilate gives in to the Jews and condemns an innocent man to die. So as we come to Luke chapter 23, the trial opens with the charges against Jesus. We read, "Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, 'We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king.'" Now, the first thing we notice here is they have changed their charges against Jesus. In their Jewish trials, they had condemned Jesus to death for blasphemy, that he claimed to be the Son of God. But they knew that this charge would not hold up in a Roman court. The Romans had many gods. And so here they changed their charge from blasphemy to treason. They say that Jesus is claiming to be a king. And of their three charges, the first one is that he is subverting the nation. He is trying to lead them to rebellion. And of course, we know this is false. Jesus never condoned violence. He never condoned the overthrow of the Roman Empire. And so this charge is just a twisting of the truth. Their second charge is that he opposes taxes to Caesar. This is an outright lie. A few days earlier, they had asked Jesus to try and trap him. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And Jesus had responded, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God. So this charge is completely false. And the third charge that he claims to be Messiah, a king, is just a twisting of the facts. Jesus never denied that he was the Messiah. And the people did call him the Son of David, a title of royalty. But you might remember back in John chapter 6, after he had fed the 5,000s, the crowd wanted to force Jesus to be their king. But Jesus refused. He had not come to be their king. He had come to die on the cross for their sins. And so Jesus had not come to be a king. One day he will be king of all the earth, but not this day. And so this charge was a twisting of the truth. Pilate now takes Jesus in and interrogates him. John 18 gives us the details. Starting verse 33, Pilate went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." See, Pilate was trying to determine, was Jesus a political threat to Rome? Or was he simply a religious teacher, maybe even a fanatic, but not a threat to the empire? Jesus tells him that my kingdom is not of this world. He was not a political threat to Rome. He uses logic. He said, if I were an earthly king, why aren't my followers out there fighting to try and save me? Well, to this, Pilate responds, "You are a king then." "You say that I am a king," Jesus answered. "In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate retorted. And with this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him." See, it appears that Pilate doesn't really believe in anything. For him, there is no ultimate truth. Jesus is just a religious fanatic, but he poses no threat to Rome. The only truth for Pilate is what was going to keep him in his job. He didn't care about spiritual truth, even though the truth himself was standing right there in front of him. Pilate's verdict that I find no charge against him should have ended the matter, but it doesn't. Pilate, is being very careful. He doesn't want another riot. He doesn't not want another bad report going back to Rome. And so he finds a loophole. Luke 23 tells us, "Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, 'I find no basis for a charge against this man.' But they insisted, 'He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here.' On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time." You see, Pilate knew he was between a rock and a hard place. He knew if he released Jesus, this man who did not deserve death, the Jewish leaders would probably write another bad report about him to Caesar. But he knew that Jesus was popular with the people. And if he crucified him, the Jewish crowds might turn against Pilate himself. So I'm sure Pilate breathed a sigh of relief. He could let someone else deal with this tinderbox situation. And so he sends him to Herod. This is Herod Antipas. He was tetrarch in Galilee from 6 AD to 39 AD. He is the son of Herod the Great, his father, who is the one who had killed the babies in Bethlehem in an attempt to get rid of the newborn king. He's also the king who beheaded John the Baptist. And Luke 23 verse 8 tells us, when Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked Jesus. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. See, Herod virtually ignores the Jewish leaders and all their accusations. He wants Jesus to perform for him. He wants to see a magic trick. And when Jesus won't perform, Herod makes him the butt of his joke. He mocks him as a fake king and then returns him back to Pilate. I'm sure Pilate's heart must have sunk when he saw the guards bringing Jesus back to his court. He thought he had gotten rid of this problem, but now it had been dropped right back in his lap. And so Luke 23 tells us, Pilate called together the chief priests and rulers of the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him." So having failed to get rid of the case, Pilate tries another scheme to get himself off the hook. Matthew 27 will tell us that he tries to let the people decide Jesus' fate. Matthew 27:15, now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time, they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Barabbas. The other Gospels tell us that he had committed murder and had been part of an insurrection. And some very ancient manuscripts of the Gospel of Matthew give us Barabbas's first name. And his first name was Jesus. And so Pilate sees these two men. One, Jesus of Nazareth, the healer and the teacher. And the other one, this murdering criminal, Jesus Barabbas. So verse 17 says, so when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked, and they all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" And so his second attempt to get off the hook has failed. He had tried to offer them a choice, and the people did not choose the way that he had anticipated. And so he resorts to another tactic. He tries to get the crowd to have pity on Jesus. In John 19, we read, "Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged." In the Jewish courts, flogging was not to exceed 40 stripes. In fact, the Jews usually only beat their prisoners 39 times to make sure they didn't go over the limit. And in a Jewish flogging, the back and the chest were the only places that you could beat a person. Roman flogging, however, had no limits on how much a man was to be beaten or what parts of the body could be beaten. In fact, it was so severe that it was called the halfway death. And so Jesus endures this beating. They used a leather whip that was knotted and weighted with pieces of metal and bone that would shred the skin as the man was flogged. Jesus would have gone into shock from the pain and the loss of blood. But that wasn't enough. The soldiers then mock Jesus. In a more elaborate joke than what Herod had done, they dressed Jesus as a comic king. with a robe and a crown of thorns and a reed scepter. And when they grow tired of their mock worship, then they turn to abuse. Matthew gives us more detail about their cruel game. Matthew 27, verse 27 says, when the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him, and they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. And they put a staff in his right hand, and they knelt in front of him and mocked him. Hail, King of the Jews, they said. And they spit on him. And they took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. John says, and they slapped him in the face. They abused him. When they were done with their fun, John 19, verse 4 says, once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. And when Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, here is the man. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, crucify! Crucify! But Pilate answered, you take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. See, Pilate had hoped that seeing Jesus beaten and broken and bleeding would satisfy this crowd, but instead it only whet their appetite for more. They were like sharks sensing blood in the water, and they cry out for Jesus to be crucified. Pilate's I find no basis of a charge against him is the height of injustice. After beating Jesus half to death, he now proclaims him to be innocent. John 19, verse 7 tells us, the Jewish leaders insisted, we have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. This is the first time Pilate has heard any charge about Jesus claiming to be the Son of God. I wonder if he believed in all the old Roman myths of the gods coming down to earth in the disguise of a human form to test people. But for whatever reason, this new information makes Pilate afraid. And he brings Jesus back inside the palace. And he asks him, where do you come from? But Jesus gave him no answer. This is not a question of his physical identity. Pilate already knew that he was from Galilee. No, this was a question of, what are your spiritual origins? Where are you from? But Jesus will not answer. Verse 10, do you refuse to speak to me, Pilate said. Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. See, Pilate is the one that's really on trial here. He had no power over Jesus except what God allowed to happen. And yet he was still going to be held accountable for his decision. Jesus said that the Jewish leaders have more guilt because unlike Pilate, they knew the true God. They knew the scriptures and they knew everything Jesus had done and taught. And yet they still rejected him. Verse 12 of John 19 says, from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. This was their final threat, the final nail in the coffin for Pilate. See, the title friend of Caesar was given to Roman officials by the emperor himself. It was the official recognition of their position. And the Jewish leaders are now threatening Pilate that if you let this man go, you aren't a friend of Caesar. We'll send another report to him claiming that you let this pretender to the throne go free. Verse 13, when Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover, and it was about noon. Here is your king, he said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away. Take him away, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate asked. We have no king but Caesar, the chief priests answered. And so after releasing Barabbas, finally Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified. This cry of the religious leaders, we have no king but Caesar, is very ironic. Back in 6 AD, the Jews had revolted against a Roman census and paying taxes to Rome. Their battle cry was, we have no king but God. But now these religious leaders are rejecting everything that they had believed in and stood for. One commentary put it this way. In one final sarcastic statement, Pilate taunted the Jews again, saying to them, behold your king. This was his way of mocking them, suggesting that this beaten, bloody, helpless man was all the king they deserved. In a chilling act of appalling hypocrisy, the chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. Though said with blatant duplicity, the irony was that there was truth in their statement. Having rejected their messianic king, they were now left with only Caesar as their king. Pilate now finally gives up and pronounces his verdict. Back in Matthew 27, starting verse 24, we read, when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. I am innocent of this man's blood, he said. It is your responsibility. And all the people answered, his blood is on us and on our children. And he handed Jesus over to be crucified. Did washing his hands absolve Pilate of his responsibility in the death of Jesus? Absolutely not. Did the cry of the Jewish leaders, his blood be on us and on our children, absolve Pilate of his responsibility? No, it did not. Many people through the centuries have used this cry by the Jewish leaders as a reason for anti-Semitism, for hatred of the Jewish people. They call them Christ killers and use this as a reason to persecute them. And this is completely wrong. Look at the crowd that was here. This is not a representation of the entire nation. These are the religious leaders who hated Jesus and their temple cronies who would do whatever their leaders told them to do. The common people followed Jesus, believed in Jesus, but by the time they learned what had happened, it was already too late to protest. Jesus was already on his way to the cross. The trials of Jesus tell us a lot about choices. See, the religious leaders had a choice, but they rejected Jesus out of envy and out of hatred. They were hostile to Jesus' invitation to come. Many people today have the same reaction to Jesus. They don't want him to be Lord of their life. They don't want anyone telling them how they should live. And so they reject Jesus' offer of salvation. Herod Antipas had a choice. He rejected Jesus because Jesus wouldn't do what he wanted him to do. He wouldn't perform for Herod's amusement. Today, people still reject Jesus because he does not meet their expectations. Jesus will not do what they want him to let them do. They want to come to Jesus on their terms and for what they can get out of it. But Jesus said, we must deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. Pilate had a choice, and he rejected Jesus because it was the easy way out. The life of one innocent man did not concern Pilate as much as keeping his job as governor. He cared more about what other people thought than in doing what he knew was right. And so he took the road that would cause the least amount of problems and sentenced Jesus to death on the cross. Many people today are just like Pilate. They want to go to heaven, but they do not want the trouble of living their lives for Jesus as part of the deal. They want everything to be easy, and living a holy life would disrupt their status quo. But true faith requires a constant battle against the world, the flesh, and the devil. As we close off this study of Jesus on trial, there are two questions that Pilate asked that each one of us must answer as well. Pilate asked, what is truth? In our world today, there is no belief in absolute truth. Relativism is a belief that my truth is just as good as your truth. And so you can't tell me that I'm wrong. But Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. If what Jesus said is the truth, and if Jesus is the truth himself, then why don't we obey what he says? Why are we not living every day in light of the truth that Jesus has given us? What is truth in our lives? The other question Pilate asked the crowd was, what then shall I do with Jesus? The answer to this question will decide your eternal destiny. Will you reject him as those who had put him on trial did? Or will you embrace him as your Lord and Savior? Turn from your life of sin and live your life today to honor and glorify the Lord Jesus.